But I think a lot of the best reps are very analytical, even if they don't realize that they are.
Hello Sales Nation and welcome to today's show. On today's show we have Duncan Lennox, who is the CEO of Qstream. On today's show we're looking at how we can level up our sales game, our skills, our ability to close deals through using or by using data. It's not as nerdy as it sounds, and there's a lot to go out in this one, a lot of practical advice. You can find out more about Duncan over at qstream.com. And with all that said, let's jump into today's show. Hi Duncan, and welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Will.
You're more than welcome, sir. I'm glad to have you on. And today we're going to talk about improving our sales performance using data. Regular listeners will know that I've got a degree in chemistry, that I'm pretty analytical minded. I enjoy the science and the data side of sales just as much as all the softer skills side of things. And I want to ask you a question here, and I think I know the answer, but you you maybe surprise me, Duncan. Are most sales professionals, and then going up the food chain, perhaps that one layer to sales management, are most sales professionals and sales management, are they data driven? Are they analytical? Or do they tend to go, when they're making sales decisions and business decisions, they tend to go more from their gut feelings?
You know, it's funny because I think if you asked the reps themselves, they'd probably tell you that it's very gut driven. But I think a lot of the best reps are very analytical, even if they don't realize that they are. And that's a big part of their success. You know, essentially, gut reactions or smart gut reactions are really people who are quite analytical, even if it's at a subconscious level, and they've gotten used to spotting patterns and what works for them. So I actually think there is a lot of process and a lot of analytics in successful reps, although they themselves might not describe themselves that way.
Okay, brilliant. So you've just turned my next few questions up on their head here, Duncan, which is fantastic. Is there a split then between the BC players and the A players in sales, in that the A players are leveraging data, again, consciously or subconsciously or consciously, regardless, they're leveraging this data to improve themselves, whereas the people who are lagging behind, those BC players, are just plowing ahead without improvement? Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And I think that represents a huge opportunity, though, for those, B or C players, as you call them, where they can take some process, they can take some data and insights and transform themselves and be significantly better as a result. Often when organizations look at their sales forces, there's a tendency to concentrate the efforts on the rainmakers, on those A players, or try to turn everybody into an A player. And that's probably not realistic. But we very much believe, with the approach we've seen, which is this data and science approach that we can talk about more, that there's a big opportunity to turn the C players into B players or B plus players. And if you can do that en masse, you can make a huge difference to the organization.
And let's just touch on this then. You said it there, Duncan. What data has Qstream acquired, or what knowledge and what science is behind all this that allows someone to make that leap? And clearly don't give away all your secrets here, but what moves the needle data-wise for individuals, whether they're using Qstream as a product and a platform, or whether they want to improve themselves after a conversation, listen to a conversation like this?
Yeah, well, I think, part of it is, firstly, it's not really about secrets. I mean, it's about actually sharing the kind of what's going on in terms of the science and the data. So it's not that there's a secret sauce necessarily in the data. But to answer the question, I maybe have to take a step back. So you've got to look at some of the macro things that have changed in sales over the last, say, 10 years or so. And it's a combination of things, but it's primarily things we all know: globalization, the rise of the internet, mobile, etc. And the fact that the B2B buying process has changed so much in the last 10 years. You look at data out there now that's showing 60, 70% of the buying cycle is now happening online, where the prospect is actually going and doing their own research long before they ever come talk to anybody that's the representative of a vendor. And so what that means is when they do finally come to talk to a sales rep from a vendor, they're probably doing it somewhat reluctantly. And there's a very narrow window of time in which that rep can add value to that prospect. And it's certainly not going to be just reciting feeds and speeds, features of their product or other things that they've already found online or that they can Google. So increasingly, it's all about how do you really add value in that really short, maybe 3-minute first conversation to establish credibility, with the prospect. And that's turning out to really be about understanding, of course, customer pain, the industry they're in, the challenges they're facing, stuff that can be quite specific. So there's skills associated with that. And then there's also knowledge of the industry, of the customer pain. So a lot of it for us is around identifying where the reps' gaps are in those skills and knowledge and helping to close them. And that's different for everybody, of course. So it's not like there's a one-size-fits-all answer to this. And that's been part of the challenge, given that everybody comes to the table with different skills and knowledge, has different gaps. How can you actually, at scale, with large sales forces, effectively help them? Because dumping the old traditional methods of pulling them in out of the field and putting them through death by PowerPoint or having these really boring e-learning modules certainly isn't going to cut it. So that, I think, has been part of the challenge. And that's where we see opportunity to help folks going forward.
Definitely. So you have already gone one step deeper than 99% of the guests that come on the show that talk about data and science behind sales, in that there's so much data of if you make so many calls, so many emails. These are all the surface layer metrics that I think the industry has been brought up on, and they make total sense. And obviously having a process in place, it works. there's no denying that. But I don't think that is potentially what separates that top 5% of salespeople versus the rest of them. What you're describing is, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but from outside looking in, that seems like what the challenges and in the knowledge that they have, the gaps in the knowledge that they have, the gaps in the expertise in the industry, that seems like the separation between the people who can follow a process and do well versus the people who really crush it, who build those lifelong relationships that are in the sales industry for decades and so have that amazing network. And clearly, everyone who's listening, all the B2B sales professionals that are listening, that's where they want to be. That's where they want to envision themselves being at the very least after listening into a show like this. So Duncan, let me ask you this then, because this is probably going to tee up the rest of our conversation here. And no one's ever come on the show, and no one's ever given me a satisfactory answer. So I'm laying on the pressure here, but I'm sure you're going to have an insight to it. How do we know? How do we become self-aware enough to know the gaps in our game? Because clearly you can't work on improving a gap before you realize it's there in the first place.
Absolutely. It's a great question. I mean, and there's a lot of good data that shows that we all as human beings naturally tend to overestimate our capability in different areas. So in other words, we all think we're great drivers. It's all the other people that are the problem, right? When we're out stuck in traffic. And it's the same with general skills. We tend to overestimate our own capability. And that, of course, does make it hard to identify where the gaps are. And traditionally, the only way you could really go about identifying those gaps in any kind of accurate way was essentially to test people, put them through batteries of tests. And there are certainly products out there that do that. There are consultancies that do that and so forth. But number one, it takes a lot of time. Number two, getting people to participate in that is understandably like pulling teeth. Nobody wants to go through that torture. And it also doesn't take account of the fact that the picture is constantly changing, right? It's not like everybody is static and you can take a snapshot of them one day and then know exactly where their gaps are and that's it. So part of the mechanism that we developed, and a lot of this comes out of the original Harvard research, was how do you actually on an ongoing basis measure, manage, and impact people's capabilities, given, as you just said, that people themselves don't necessarily know how to do that. And even if they could, will tend to overestimate things. So we turn this all into a process that's kind of ongoing every day or every other day for 3 minutes a day. And we're doing both the measuring and the impacting at the same time. So we're actually having people respond to what we call challenge-based scenarios. So it could be a video scenario or it could be text and images. It's putting them into a selling scenario that's designed to really tease out a particular skill or a particular piece of knowledge. And usually it's presented to them in the form of, what do you do next? A multiple choice question. And as soon as they respond to it, they get to see again in video or text and image form what the correct response was or the best response was and why. So the content then repeats periodically over regular intervals of time. So it might come around again in a month, for example. And what that allows us to do is build up a picture over time of each individual sales rep's gaps and the areas that they've mastered. And then the system automatically adapts and sends them content that focuses in on the areas where they're uniquely struggling. So essentially, we turn the whole process into this easy 3-minute a day competition, actually, where they're scoring points and competing against their peers on leaderboards that the reps actually enjoy. But in the background, we're sifting through the data to uniquely identify the strengths and weaknesses of each rep.
Amazing. Let me ask you something here that it might sound like a bit of a silly question, and it might have a super simple answer. But how do you know what the best response to the scenario is, if that makes sense? Because clearly, you're pulling together a whole bunch of scenarios that in reality might have, A, B, C different options that might be as good or better than the others. How do you define what is the best, and how do you come to that conclusion?
So there's a few ways that can work. So firstly, to be clear, we're providing the platform to do all of this. We're not building the content itself. So we're giving our clients the tools to build the content. We also have large networks of partners that have content available to cover different selling methodologies or can build content for our clients. But within the specific individual scenarios, again, there's a lot of the research that's kind of led us down this path, and we could talk about different parts of it if it made sense to. But there's a few things to talk about. The first one is, typically in a best practice example of a Qstream scenario, of the 4 possible responses, let's say, that you might be presented with, which one do you think is the best one? Usually one of them is kind of fairly obviously wrong. One of them is the best one, and 2 others are pretty close that you might have thought they were reasonable responses. So then in the explanation, the best explanations will usually explain not just why we think the best response is the best response, but why the other 2 are okay, but not really the optimal opportunity. So usually that's being put together by the client themselves. So they've determined from their best practices that it is indeed the best response. There's some research that shows that having a definitive best response is an effective way for people to learn. Because yes, it might not cover 100% of scenarios, but if it's covering the 80% of the cases, giving people a clear answer that they can take away is usually worth a lot more than potentially confusing them with a lot of nuance, at least initially. Yeah. Finally, though, there are some scenarios where we're trying to work on with teams where there genuinely is no best answer. And it may be a question of, depending very much on the circumstances and so forth. So we actually have a scenario type in Qstream that allows us to gather free-form responses from all the reps and then kind of collapse them down. We do some work on the back end to collapse down equivalent responses. And then we actually have the reps vote on which ones they think are the best ones and show that data back to all the reps. Now, that's usually used more in a scenario where really there isn't any clear right or wrong answer. Because as I was saying, in a typical scenario, the clarity of, yes, this is the best response, this is the one you should remember, usually far outweighs the benefit of nuance, at least in the early stages.
Definitely. Okay, so this leads me on, Duncan, too. And I don't know if you can add context to all the data that you've got on the back end to be able to answer this question, but are there any scenarios that come up through all the different companies that are on the platform, or all companies that are using it? Are there any specific scenarios that come up over and over and over that people are getting wrong routinely?
I think it's difficult to say that there's the same scenario coming up over and over again. I mean, generally, what we'll find over time is that an individual client, and our clients tend to be very large, they tend to have thousands of sales reps. So it is really interesting. The data is statistically significant that we gather over time. We'll typically see over time the set of different areas that they cover expand. So some clients will start with something like a product launch, or at this time of the year in January, for example, a sales kickoff perhaps is a very common event that's going on. Selling methodologies generally is definitely something that we see a lot of. Particularly we'll see a client rolling out a new sales methodology, and what they'll want to do is reinforce and make sure that reps are actually getting coached on the use of the methodology as they go. rather than just attending a workshop and then forgetting it all once they get back in the field. So the topic areas will vary quite a bit. I would say, rather than a specific skill area, I would say something that we see that happens all the time is that when we first work with the client, they'll say, we understand from Qstream, we're going to get some data on what it is that people know and don't know. And we know it's probably going to be, much poorer than we hoped. And the reality is, when the data comes back initially, it's usually considerably worse than they even expected. So it can be very surprising, and it can be incredibly insightful to organizations as well. Like when people run their first Qstream, we often have an issue where they're very concerned about not bothering the sales force, right? There's a lot of initiatives out there. It can be very overwhelming to the sales force. They don't want it to be, here comes yet another thing that's going to not really add a lot of value for us. So there's a tendency often, certainly in that first Qstream, to want to keep the content and the challenges fairly simple. And we work hard with organizations to show them our best practices, to say, that's not really what you want to do. If you make the scenarios too simple, people won't engage with it. They'll feel that you're kind of belittling them almost. Why are you wasting my time with this obvious stuff? So we'll usually work to try and pull them back a little bit more towards making them a little bit more challenging. Now, it's always a fine line, because we don't want them to be so challenging that they're frustrating. But there's a tendency for them to be too easy initially. So we'll pull them back a little bit more towards the middle. So we'll end up with scenarios in that first Qstream maybe that aren't quite as challenging as we might have liked, but they're certainly not gimmies. And yet, as the data starts to come back, even on the first few challenges, they'll start to see that really the picture is, quite a bit different to what they thought. So as the sales enablement team or sales management is seeing the data, maybe from the very first scenario, and let's say we get the first 1,000 reps responding to that in the first day or two, and they look at the data and they can see all this data in real time, and it might be showing them, that 2 out of 3 people got the correct answer for that scenario. They selected what was indeed felt to be, the best response, the best next step. And you'll see it kind of suddenly dawn on them that, wait a minute, 2 out of 3 people got it right. That means 1 out of 3, a third of our sales force got it wrong. And this was something that pretty simple and basic that we assumed just everybody knew and everybody understood. So suddenly simply moving from the point of view of having no data at all really around the capability of your sales force, other than, what I call rear view mirror data. Obviously you see performance, what they actually sell, but that's after the fact when it's too late to do anything about it. Now suddenly you're seeing some initial early capability data into what they know. And that's often tremendous. I mean, I often call it the glass of ice water for the guy crawling through the desert. It's early data. We're not saying this is the be all and end all of data yet, or certainly ever saying that you should be making hiring or firing decisions on the back of data like this. But suddenly for the first time, you're getting actual data on what people know and what people understand.
So let me ask you this then on that very point. So if salespeople specifically and individually overestimate their abilities, it sounds like sales management overestimate the abilities of their sales team as well. And obviously, I assume this goes up the food chain, the higher you go and the more stuff there is, and the bigger the quantity of data and the more significant it becomes once you've got those numbers rolling through it and the dashboard in front of you. How do you find that changes internally in the company, spending on things like training or sales rep development and things of that nature? Is this a huge eye-opener for senior management in that there's 2 ways of looking at it. One, either the sales team has amazing opportunity to improve themselves even further, or there's the other side of it of a really depressing scenario, and you can have the same data leading to either conclusion. But is this something you find where you add this data and then it enables the senior management to go, right, we can do this, we're going to spend more on this, we're going to really work on our team, or did they just get depressed about it?
No, it's an interesting question, because I've never seen anybody get depressed about it. I mean, there can be a little bit of a realization, okay, it is bad. People are not remembering enough and don't know enough that we need them to be successful. But we always think of that as a huge challenge and opportunity in terms of driving, obviously, revenue and margin and whatever that might be. So we don't focus Qstream as a cost saving for an organization or anything of that nature. We see it as something that is really designed to actually directly drive top line and, and bottom line growth. So the way I think of it is, here's where you are today, whatever your revenue numbers are today, with the sales force that you have today. And look at now all of the potential we have if we optimize that by actually changing those capabilities, improving them over time. If we can do that even a little bit, we focus on this idea of, moving the middle. So as I was saying earlier on, not necessarily worrying about the rainmakers, the top performers, they're doing well. They probably don't need a lot of help. But if you go and you look, again, a data-driven approach at, quota performance across your sales team, typically what you'll see is a normal distribution, a typical, bell curve. So you'll have the top 5 or 10% of your sales force that maybe are delivering on average 120% of quota. And you'll have the bottom 5 or 10% that are maybe only delivering 60% of quota. So obviously we can help there. But plus or minus 2 standard deviations basically from the average, you've got the 60% essentially in the middle that are probably delivering average quota performance of, 101, 102%, something like that typically is what we would see. So what we're focused on is, can we move that entire block in the middle 1 or 2 or 3 percentage points up in terms of the average? Because in the scale of companies that we work with, that translates into tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in incremental revenue. And it costs almost nothing because the costs of that sales force are already sunk cost. So it's essentially pure margin as well that drops right to the bottom line. So usually what happens is, the picture is worse than they expected it to be, but then people start to see and get excited about the opportunity, because if you're coming from this place down here, and it's much easier to move it up a little bit and then start to see some impact from that.
So let's get real practical about this, Duncan. So if we're using a Qstream or we're using a platform or we've got a coach in a sales manager that knows what they're doing, and they've made us self-aware. They've pointed out the holes in our game, the gaps in our knowledge, the gaps in our expertise, both in just business acumen in general, in product knowledge, in how to deal with relationships, the process. You can probably go on for days of all the different angles that we could go out with this. But what is the step to filling these gaps? Is it, and I'm sure Qstream might be more complex than this, but is it things along the lines of spaced repetition learning, of testing yourself against a scenario or a set of questions or however you want to do it, and then finding where you fail and coming back to them and keep going over it and keep drilling it into your head? Is it doing an hour a morning of research on the topics that that you've got holes in? Is there a data-driven way to improve ourselves, not just become self-aware of the problems?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, you have to do it in a way that works for the way people work now. So, I think the idea of spending an hour in the morning and digging out the material you're going to go through and so forth, that just doesn't work anymore, right? That's old school. Nobody has the time for that, or maybe even the interest level to do that. So the way we think about it in Qstream is kind of an 80-20 piece, that 80% of the improvement is going to be driven automatically by the Qstream platform. And that is, as you engage for 3 minutes a day and we build up a picture of where your areas of strength and weakness are, we're going to stop wasting your time with material that you've already shown mastery of, and we're going to focus in on the areas where you're struggling. And that is going to use things like spaced repetition, but it will still be in what we call the Qstream way. And the Qstream way is a set of principles that we use around how we build the product. And the most fundamental one is respecting people's time. And that's our 3 minute a day process. So 3 minutes a day doesn't sound like a lot of time, but bear in mind that if it's 3 minutes a day every day, and the Qstream system is automatically adapting the content that is seen by each rep individually in those 3 minutes a day, that over time, it's very powerful what we can achieve. And of course, this all comes back out of the research done at Harvard Medical School, and our methodology is clinically proven to engage long-term retention and ingrained behaviors and so forth, to drive those behavior change pieces that we need. But 80% of it being handled, therefore, automatically by the system. So that's closing a lot of the gap. For that last 20%, then, that's where we really think your manager coach comes in. And that's a big part of what we're doing as well, because we'll sift through all the data that we have on an individual. And for that person's manager, we're going to start surfacing what we call coaching opportunities. So we're going to surface typically 3 coaching opportunities at a time for a frontline manager. And that's a manager typically managing 6 or 8 or 10 reps in the field or inside of its inside sales force. So for that manager, then we similarly have a kind of 3-minute a day process, if you will, where we'll surface those coaching opportunities for them. And those coaching opportunities are all about solving a fundamental problem in sales management, which is this. Often what happens is the best reps get promoted to be sales managers. But the problem is, it turns out being a sales manager is a totally different job than being a sales rep. So although these new managers have tremendous field experience about what works with prospects, what they don't necessarily have is an understanding of how to coach, who to coach, and where that coaching is needed.
I've been there, Duncan. You're outlining a number of managers that I've had in the past.
And and why should they know that? They've never had to do it before, right? So it's not that they should just automatically know it. What they have is tremendous experience. They have the war stories, right? They've been in the difficult sales. They've lost deals to competitors. They understand what the rep is dealing with on a daily basis. So that's fantastic. So what we're trying to do is then just help take it that last step. So we can come in and say, for example, to that manager, and they have a dashboard live where they can see this on their phone or laptop or iPad. We might be coming in and saying, hey, you know what? Will is doing great this week. So you might want to send him a thumbs up to let him know he's doing a great job. But Duncan is really struggling when it comes to positioning the new pricing model. Would you like to start a coaching dialogue with him now? And then right within Qstream, we'll step that manager through how they can start a coaching session right within the system with that direct report, focusing them right in on the specific area where they should work on today, even pulling in a piece of relevant content that they can use as part of the conversation. So we get that 80% driven automatically by the adaptive system. And that's a good experience that the rep likes because it's easy. It's 3 minutes a day. They just need to get to trust us over time that we'll put the right 2 scenarios in front of them. And then for the manager, directing them in, how do they close those gaps for their reps and helping them see exactly where the reps need help. And that's an ongoing process. Every day we're sifting through the data and surfacing the right coaching opportunities. So the system is constantly adjusting to how the reps are changing, and which of course is an effect of what's going on in the marketplace and a bunch of other things.
How far away from reality are we, the position where AI can coach an individual from data? Obviously, you'd have to humanize it and taking that out of the equation, because that doesn't seem like the most difficult kind of task. But how far are we from AI being able to coach better than a sales manager? Because clearly AI can pull from all the sales managers and all the data that you've got across the planet versus just an individual's experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's an area where we're spending a lot of time. And certainly I would argue, of course, we're already started down that road. I mean, with a lot of this data, I see our job as sifting through the raw data to turn that into insights that people can take action on simply, right? So there's no point presenting just raw data back to people. So we've already started down that road. On the other hand, a lot of B2B selling, at least, is about relationship building, is about empathy, is about building trust, things that are still a struggle for AI. So I think it's a little bit different to, say, Watson coming in and replacing doctors in many ways, where if you look at that example, Watson might be great at actually doing the diagnosis and figuring out, you know what, if it's unfortunately the case that I have cancer. But we don't necessarily want Watson presenting that diagnosis back to the patient, right? Because that's not necessarily going to be the human-to-human experience and the empathy that's needed.
Yeah, this big block rolls into the room with just a printout that says,
exactly,
you've got a week to live.
So, there's a little bit of an analogy there, I think. So certainly we can help a lot. I mean, the way that we see it is using data, using AI to really direct the limited resources of the manager, because they're busy, right? And there's only so many managers, to the people that really need the help when they need the help. And that's that 80-20 piece again. So at some point in the future, could AI and technology like that replace human coaching, or to your point, be better, be more effective in terms of the outcomes they drive? I've no doubt that could happen. But in the short and medium term, I think AI is about helping facilitate the right conversations at the right time, rather than necessarily taking the human component out of it entirely.
For sure. Perhaps we can have you back on to dive further into AI, because I think it has to just shake up the world of sales in the not too distant future. So maybe that's a conversation for another time. But I've got one final question for you, Duncan, before I ask a couple of questions that I ask everyone that comes on the show. And that is, typically, again, like from the data that you have and the data that everyone's passing to your platform, which leads to the best bang for buck improvement in sales performance? Is it filling gaps in your knowledge, and obviously that covers a whole section of sales, or is it using technology to change your behaviors?
Oh, it's definitely the latter. I mean, using Qstream to make sure reps have the knowledge they need to be successful, whether that's, simply product knowledge or some of the other things we were talking about, like industry knowledge and understanding the challenges that a client is having. That's all valuable, of course, and that's necessary. But the real opportunity to move the needle and where we see the biggest impact is certainly around skills. Whether that's negotiation, whether that's closing skills, whether that's building empathy, building relationships, for sure, that's where the biggest opportunity is.
And is there any, again, I appreciate you might not have the specifics because it's other people putting content on your platform to measure it all, but are there any standout behaviors that, again, really practical for the audience, that data shows, and so statistically they're going to be most likely affected by this, that they should be working on above all others?
I think if there was one area I was going to highlight where we see a lot of opportunity for improvement, let's put it that way, is qualification skills. The ability to really go through a discovery process and qualify a customer. Everything from the simple, obvious, meat and potatoes things about do they have budget and authority and so forth, understanding where they are in the process, how big of a pain point it is, not just for them, but for senior management. That's probably where the most obvious opportunity is, because I think, a lot of us, in the industry see this. It's an age-old problem and it hasn't gone away, is that a lot of salespeople confuse activity with progress. And asking the hard questions and figuring out where the customer really is in the process. You might be afraid of the answer you're going to get, but again, the other old adage in sales, of course, is the best answer I can get is yes, but the second best answer I can get is no.
And do you feel, I love this, so prospecting specifically, do you feel that, or it feels the wrong word, do you know that it's down to the question being a bit of a portion, it's a bit of a value suck to ask that kind of question? Is it down to, are those questions not getting asked because of that, or are they not getting asked because people don't know that they should be asking them?
I think people get into bad habits, right? People get into patterns, right? Bringing it back to the behavior change piece, patterns establish over time, and we're all familiar with this. Trying to break any habit, I'm going to exercise more this year. I'm going to drink less coffee, whatever it might be. These are similar processes in the brain to a business skill, in the sense that they're all about patterns that are established. So it's probably something that people know at an intellectual level they should be doing. I'm sure it's something they heard at different times, but they may not have ever established the patterns. And in fact, we now need to break the bad patterns they've established and establish those best practices. So it's almost, again, it gets very complex, but it's almost on a subconscious level that this might be happening or not happening, as the case may be. And that's where something that is around driving behavior change like Qstream can be very powerful.
Fantastic. Okay. Duncan, I've got a couple of questions to ask everyone that comes on the show, mate. First one, other than Qstream, are there any books or resources that you'd recommend specifically to the Salesman Podcast audience?
That's a great question. In terms of for an individual rep themselves,
yeah,
I'm really enjoying it. It's not a direct answer to your question because it's not necessarily something a rep can use themselves. But I have been playing around and looking a lot into Salesforce's new Einstein technology, and we were just talking about AI earlier. And I think that's interesting because it's starting to create a platform for AI that's available to everybody, that isn't just available to data scientists. So I think we're going to see things from technologies like Einstein and others going forward. In terms of day-to-day, when I look at the best-in-class reps, we're talking about skills through all of this conversation and how important they are, and I obviously think that's the case. But it still amazes me how process-wise the best reps have their process down cold as well. And by process there, I even mean simple things like to-dos and follow-ups and how they do that. So, for me, that's something I've tried to use just in my day-to-day life, and finding a good, even simple to-do list manager. I love Wunderlist, which is the one that I use. It's deliberately quite simple. There's very complex ones out there, but I think complexity ends up frustrating you and you end up throwing it aside. So I found something simple that's very effective for me, and that's Wunderlist.
Good stuff. We'll link to both those in the show notes of this episode over at salesman.red. And final question, Duncan, something that I've asked everyone that's come on the show, and that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
My grandmother used to say, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, and you should use them in that level of priority. So I think there's so much we want to get in there, and I'm an engineer by training, so often I want to get in there and just tell you all the great things my product does and how it's going to make your life better. But I've learned the more I shut up and let you talk and tell me about your problems, the more effective I can be and the more I can speak to your specific needs. So it's a simple one, but that's something that I wish I knew 20 years ago.
And was that a realization that you had in a moment? Is this something you've learned over the years through just experience? Was this something that was trained into you? Because it's a very common complaint that I know sales managers and customers have about salespeople. So I'm just intrigued to how you came to that conclusion.
Yeah, I think I'd love to say that it was a great insight I had early on. I think it was, unfortunately for me, just a hard-won lesson over time, starting to listen more, being more willing to accept that I don't have the answers, and also not rushing, again, as an engineer, to just want to fill the space with all of the cool things my product can do. Partially, it was starting to read the room and learn how to read the room better and noticing the eyes glazing over. And some good sales mentors that I've been fortunate enough to have along the way as well, and watching how they work. And I think without exception, the best sales mentors and best sales people that I've seen have clarity of process, as I was talking about earlier, but also have a tremendous gift for asking open-ended questions and then shutting up and listening to the answers.
Definitely. Well, with that, Duncan, tell us a little bit more about Qstream. Give us a quick pitch and then tell us where we can find out more about it.
Sure, absolutely. Well, Qstream is a SaaS platform and a mobile-first application that's designed to allow large sales forces to measure and manage and impact the capability of their sales force. So we allow you to change behaviors at scale, and we do it all by having your reps interact on their phone in 3 minutes a day with our scenario-based challenges. And it's all clinically proven based on over a decade of neuroscience research at Harvard Medical School. So we've been able to move business outcomes for some of the world's largest brands, from Pfizer to MasterCard to LinkedIn, all by having their reps participate in 3 minutes a day. And you can find out more about us on the web at qstream.com, or follow us on Facebook or Twitter at Qstream.
Amazing. We'll link to all that in the show notes to this episode, again, over at salesman.red. And with that, Duncan, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your insights. I think I could feel that there was loads of potential rabbit holes that we could have gone down, for example, the AI one. So, open invitation for you to come back on in the future and talk a little bit more about that, mate, because I enjoy these conversations of projecting sales, that 5-10 years into the future. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Great. Thanks so much.